So, first question, what was your involvement in the anti-war movement?
Involvement in the anti-war movement back in the 60s. I was a student senator at Southern Illinois University. Our involvement became gradual until it escalated into the 70s, where it became a big part of what the student government was trying to say: no more war, let's have peace, bring our boys home.
Alright, so what action by the government made you start protesting?
Well, the action by the government that made everyone start protesting, of course, was the draft itself, and the fact that people were involuntarily being drafted to go into the service to fight a war that a lot of people could not justify. And because they could not justify it in their minds and in their hearts, a lot of other Americans thought they were being un-American.
Do you think this draft was permitted? Like, do you think it was okay that the government allowed this to happen?
Well, the government has the right in time of war to draft, of course, but we honestly did not believe that this particular war was any kind of a necessity to the American people. There's no way that South or North Vietnam is affecting America at that time. Or did they have the capabilities of affecting America in any way as far as going to war there?
So this wasn't a declared war, Vietnam, okay?
No, actually it was what they called a police action.
Yeah.
I think it started with Kennedy. And Kennedy was going to send in troops that were actually going to act as policemen. But in actuality, it was a war. And no matter what they call it, it was a war. Thousands of Americans and thousands of Vietnamese were dying. And a lot of the people back home that were not involved in the war, that were students, were learning that the things that they were fighting for in Vietnam may not have been what the American government was telling us. That they were fighting communists and trying to hold back all of that stuff from taking over our country. And instead they were going after domination in other countries. And the big thing, of course, again, was war. And then they had the war machine, the factories that make all these bombs and planes and so on and so forth. They can't make any money without a war going on.
Yeah.
Usually when we had a protest, it was a unanimous decision by the student senate and by the graduate student and the president of the student body. What they would do is they'd have normal protests at different locations around the university, sometimes at the president of the university's home, saying stop the war. And hundreds, sometimes thousands of students would come out and participate. But we weren't looked at as Americans with the right to protest. We were looking at, they were looking at us like we were communist sympathizers, hippies, people that weren't even from the university. And that was totally not true. Most of the people that were there were just, red-blooded American boys and girls like throughout the entire country, just being demonized by the press and people who were for the war because they didn't agree with their viewpoints.
Alright, so in college specifically, was there a draft in your region? Were you ever drafted?
The draft was national. I was classified 1A when I left college in 1973. I believe that there was a huge protest that went up after the United States entered Cambodia and was going to extend the war. And campuses throughout the entire United States went up in an uproar and everybody started protesting, so they just simply closed the campuses. They shut down the universities in May and said, if that's the way you're going to act, then we'll close the universities and you won't have any protests. Well, I guess basically it worked because after that, not too long after that, the war ended. And most of us who left school in that May never went back.
Alright, so obviously the war ended before you were drafted into it. So
The war did end before I got drafted. I was reclassified 1A, and the war did end before I got drafted.
okay. So why do you think the escalation of war in Vietnam was such a bad thing?
Well, if they escalated the war to Cambodia, that would be a whole another country involved in the war. Once Cambodia is in, then there's going to be another nation in, and the more nations involved in the war, you always have the effect of China now starting to saying, hey, wait a minute, they're starting to take over countries, not one country, and that could lead to another world war. And we don't need another world war, ever. We should have learned from the first World War and the Second World War that war is not the answer. We're human beings. We should be able to sit down and communicate what our needs and desires and our fears are, and talk them out and work them out so that we can live in peace.
And just to be clear, this is the sole reason you were protesting in college, correct? The escalation of war in Vietnam, or to stop
Well,
the
not
escalation?
the sole reason. I mean, there were many reasons. You know, each day there was a new situation, a new problem, a new massacre. The My Lai massacre was a huge nightmare for Americans who thought our troops were there busily being the superb, honest troops that they were. Now we're finding out that they're actually massacring people. And rightly or wrongly, we believed it was wrong, and dead wrong to have Americans doing things like that in other countries for war or for anything else.
When you said we, and that means just the protesters or the entire
Well, I
American?
would say most of the protesters that were against the war. But I would say even people in America that weren't against the war found that to be a totally heinous situation that they wanted to end and get the troops out so that stuff like that would never happen. The military, even today with Afghanistan, they're talking about coming out of Afghanistan by the end of the year, but leaving 10,000 troops as, again, advisors, or what they would call policemen. I think they should bring them all out, to be honest with you. I think they should bring them all home. I don't see anything they're achieving there. All I hear are people getting killed. What are they actually achieving? Do they ever come on TV and say, okay, we've been in Afghanistan for, this is the longest war in the history of America. This is what we achieved. I don't think I've ever seen anything.
Yeah,
And
and
in that
then
regard.
you can draw a parallel with Vietnam because people were only
And
dying.
Vietnam too. They're having all these battles. But what exactly were they achieving? What were they trying to
At
gain?
the end of the day, when all is said and done, what made you stop protesting? Was it the end of the war?
Well, the stopping the protesting, of course, was the end of the war. There's nothing to protest if there's no war. President Nixon had resigned office not too long after that. I believe it was in '74. The war, of course, came to an end, and everything seemed to be getting back into where America should be. It's taking care of its own country and take care of its own people.